ever been in a meeting where you're supposed to come up with a solution or come to a better understanding of a controversial topic? And then when you leave, you feel like nothing really got accomplished, and maybe you just agreed to disagree, even though maybe you did come to a better understanding or come with more information, nothing really got done. Did you know what it was exactly that kept you from moving forward? Perhaps it's because you thought you were going to go in for a dialogue, and actually you ended up either in a debate or a discussion. Do you know the difference between the three? Debate, discussion, and dialogue? I've asked 3 of my esteemed colleagues to take on 3 different perspectives on the topic of religious violence and go through a debate, a discussion, and then a dialogue. In the first segment, they're going to engage in debate, and I think it's going to be obvious what is going on there.
Thank you all for joining me today. I wanted to have a conversation about religious violence and the causes of religious violence. And I really feel very strongly that the cause of religious violence is political. Behind all of the instrumentalization of religion, there's really just political reasons there. Don't you agree?
No.
I don't agree.
What do you mean?
Well, I think you can point to political factors, certainly, that are playing into religious violence. But when it comes to it, it's ultimately about ideas. It's ultimately about a difference in doctrines.
That's not
some religious communities have certain beliefs that motivate, that animate their actions.
They're just used by leaders, though, to foment violence. It's not like those differences are actually causing the violence.
But you're assuming that leaders are the only people who matter.
Yeah, at least in terms of creating the violence.
You've got to be kidding me.
No, I'm
Leaders
not
aren't
kidding
the
you.
only people who even do violence. Violence is totally the result of culture. I mean, when 2 different cultures meet one another and they have differences, those differences are going to lead to conflicts. And do you know where violence comes from? Violence comes from conflicts.
No. Everybody knows that history is the history of great men, political leaders who use
You've got
culture.
to be kidding me. It's 2016.
So
I
I
know
think
what
that
year it
history
is.
is the history of great men and women, Brian, but that's an idea, and it goes back to this essential point about doctrines. It's not just a matter of authority, and I think it's not just a matter of cultural movements. I think what really gives shape to these different communities and separates them from one another, what gives them their identity, are these foundational beliefs. And you can't get away from that. I mean, certainly these things are factors, but ultimately, the fundamental point, I think, is about doctrinal differences.
I believe all you're doing is you're giving lip service to trying to include women into the conversation. So you're attacking Brian for saying that it's just, history is just a blah, 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 and powerful men. And you're like, no, women matter too. But let's talk about doctrine. You want to talk about doctrine? All you're doing is talking about old, stuffy white men with corduroy patches on their flipping elbow
all you did was take
jackets.
off your corduroy patches.
So if you're going to talk about doctrine, you're again just like only having a patriarchal conversation, and that's why this is all about culture. If you want to have a conversation that you're just like, it's all politics, like, it's all doctrine, okay, enjoy your little old boys club where it's just a bunch of dudes that get around and they debate things and they talk about things.
We're getting a little off. You clearly have some issues that you're trying to work through right now. All right, let's at least, maybe we can agree on the solution to religious violence, which is clearly to identify the political, social, economic factors that really lie behind the way that religion is exploited and used to cover over these things. So definitely we have to look at these problems, these other problems, and that's how we can solve religious violence, is by addressing those grievances, other grievances, political grievances.
No, when you first brought up that point, you said political, social, and economic issues.
Not cultural.
All 3 of those fall under the category of culture. According to what?
According to my definition of it, which I believe is the most correct one.
And your definition is what?
Culture is something that's invented. It's not even a real thing. The Germans invented their culture. The Turks invented their culture. Before that, these nations' identities, these national identities, cultural identities, didn't exist.
I believe you need to
What
take a little
political
lesson.
challenges did.
I think you need to take a lesson from our good friend Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about how not only do we shape our culture, but our culture in turn shapes us. And you can't see the forest for the trees when you're a part of your culture. So even the fact that you are making the argument that you're making, and you're making the argument you're making, is because you've been formed by the culture around you.
But let's talk about how culture forms us and how politics forms us. These are interesting ideas, but that's what they are. They're ideas. And you just quoted a thinker who's written about some important critical ideas. If we
Who's
wanna
also an
see
anthropologist.
This change. And
Yeah, so it supports your view. How about pulling somebody from how about a political scientist?
How about you let Kevin speak?
we talk in terms of ideas. I think if we're going to reach
He
any
interrupted me, too.
agreement about religious violence and the solution for it, it's going to come first from human beings getting together and solving these differences that are at the level of these foundational beliefs and ideas, at the level of doctrine.
So you
in the
wanna-
same way that we're disagreeing about ideas here.
So you think ideas exist in a vacuum that aren't shaped by the culture around them?
I think they're not reducible to cultural and social movements. I think there's still something important and stable about these ideas.
This untouchable idea that moves through time without being shaped or changed?
Well, that was engaging, but it wasn't very productive, was it? What if they turned then to having a discussion? Let's see how that goes.
So I invited you all here today to have a conversation about what causes religious violence and how we can solve it. And I just want to put forward my idea, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say and maybe see if you agree with what I think. So I've done a lot of study on this. I've spent time in the Middle East, and I've talked to a lot of people. And what I really strongly feel is that religious violence is really just political violence, that it's caused by these underlying economic or political grievances that aren't being addressed. And then you get leaders who rise up, who are only focused on power, and they take hold of these grievances and they articulate them using religious language because it speaks to the people that they want to mobilize. And so really what we need to be doing is focusing on those political, economic, and other social grievances and try to work through those, and that's how we can deal with religious violence. Because religious violence is, I think, probably a misnomer. It's political violence wrapped up in religious ideas and arguments. What do you think, Kevin?
Well, I think this is an important perspective, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate your experience in the Middle East informing this as well. It's certainly the case that there's a political dimension to religious violence. At the same time, I think when we look at what occasions religious violence and what sustains it, it's really, I think, these doctrinal differences, these important differences regarding fundamental beliefs and values, these things that people cherish and that make them who they are, that really shape their individual and cultural identities. So while it's certainly the case that you have governments and political institutions and persons in positions of authority manipulating people for political ends, I think the fact that people are in a position to allow themselves to be manipulated comes down to these differences that have to do with their identities that are formed in some sense by these that chief kind of authoritative doctrines.
But if it was really about those doctrines, wouldn't we be seeing people who have different religious backgrounds always in conflict with one another? I mean, if you just take a country like Syria, which is falling apart right now, supposedly due to religious violence, why wasn't it falling apart? Why weren't Sunnis and Shiites and Christians and Yazidis and others, same thing in Iraq, why weren't they attacking one another before if it's about doctrinal differences?
I think the tensions were already there. I think you have this sense of conflict under the surface, so to speak, just ready to boil over. But in each of these traditions, you have some justifications for religious violence. You have some moments in the traditions and the history of these religious communities in which there's a sense that God is fighting for them. God is on their side and trying to vanquish their
You
enemies.
agree with me, right, Emily?
Yes and no. So I think there's some truth to what both of you are saying, but I think you're ignoring something that's staring you right in the face, and that's culture. So even, Brian, as you're talking about yeah, I mean, political leaders are the ones who are often behind many forms of violence, but the only reason why political leaders have any power is because the people in their culture have elected them to positions of power, or have allowed them to move into those positions of power. And Kevin, as you're talking about, a lot of this is about ideas. Ideas don't come out of nowhere. Ideas don't all of a sudden pop up into people's heads and then all of a sudden they're movers and shakers in the world. Like, no, ideas come from culture. Politics come from culture. So I think there's some truth to what both of you are saying. But I think, you guys are looking at, if we can imagine like a chessboard, you guys are looking at the pieces moving around, and I think you're ignoring that this chessboard's kind of wonky. There's this weird magnetic force underneath it moving everything around, and that's culture.
Yeah.
So there's some truth, I think, to what both of you are saying, but I really think it all comes down to culture, and culture encompasses both of your points.
I think you make a fair point. I actually think your point is probably stronger than Kevin's point. That culture is a big factor here. But when it comes to the solution, how can one change a culture when one can actually address political problems? You can go after political culture. You can try to change political culture. You can try to introduce democratic norms, values of egalitarianism. You can try to shape political solutions, which maybe over time will affect the culture. But so I think when it comes down to coming up with a solution, the political factor is probably more important. That's what I feel.
I think you're both raising some very good points, but I think in one respect at least, you're both also importantly wrong. There is a sense in which we're getting things reversed here. We're putting the cart before the horse. It's really the ideas that we use to communicate these things. So while there are important differences in culture, and while there are important differences in politics, the only way that we can communicate in human beings and have some kind of solution to this, and we haven't even started talking about the solution, is through coming to some agreement on these basic differences that are at the level of ideas and concepts. So even if they have some kind of cultural formation behind them or some kind of political undercurrent, still it's going to be about these ideas.
I think there are certainly ideas that need to be addressed, but the ideas that are the differences between different religious groups are not necessarily the ones causing the conflict. I mean, I really think that you're right about ideas. You really are. But I think you're wrong in describing the ideas that are the ones that are promoting this conflict.
I still really think culture encompasses what both of you are saying and says a lot more about this. Because if it all comes down to political violence, then why is it that every instance of, say, religious violence that you think we can explain by, it's democracy versus totalitarianism, wouldn't that instance of violence look the exact same time and time again if it's just politics or even if it's just ideas? No, every instance of violence is different. It's culturally contextualized. If it was all about politics or if it was all about ideas, then why is it that every conflict between a Muslim and a Jew, it should all be the same every time if it's all about ideas? Or every time, again, it's like a democracy versus some sort of dictatorship, the violence should look the same time and time again if it all comes down to politics. But we know that like every instance of violence, they don't look the same just because it's the same ideas or the same types of political systems that are coming up against one another. I mean, I think you guys are both really ignoring a bigger thing, that there's truth to what you're saying, but like you're missing the forest for the trees.
So what's the cultural solution then? If you're saying that culture is you're granting there's some role for politics, there's some role for ideology, doctrinal ideologies. But your argument, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that that culture is the more important element. So what's the solution then?
Well, I think the solution,
assuming that you're right.
I think the solution has to come from the level of culture and people in the everyday world because, have you ever seen an instance of violence where all of a sudden it's changed because one group is like, I agree with you, you have the right idea. Or some instance of violence where, I mean, think about all of the coups that have happened around the world, that nothing really changed. We just swapped one dictator for another. Or, you know, we...
Because the political grievances weren't dealt with, but no.
But,
I think you can put a
think
lid on it with culture or politics, but ultimately, I mean, these are real differences that just have to do with what people think and the way they think and the way that they believe. And unless you can come to some mutual understanding at that level, you're just papering over the real difficulty.
Okay. Well,
I think
we
we're
might
just going to have to agree to disagree.
I
I think that
was-
might be the only thing we agree on,
I
is
was
that
going
we
to say
disagree.
that we can agree to disagree. So I appreciate you all having this conversation.
I disagree about that.
You disagree.
Of course you do.
All right, I think that went a little bit better than the debate, didn't you? But it really didn't do anything other than end in, we agree to disagree. And I have to wonder whether they really even felt like they had been heard, or whether they were even moving anywhere close to any kind of mutual understanding or moving towards a solution to the problem that could really advance the topic. So what they were doing in the last segment is doing a discussion, and we call a lot of stuff discussion, and I think that it goes pretty much in that way. But really what we want is to engage in dialogue. Take a look at this next segment and see if you can see the difference between debate, discussion, and dialogue.
So I invited you here today because I really wanted to engage in a dialogue about the causes of religious violence and maybe see if we can come up with some solutions for it, or just brainstorm some ideas about how we might address religious violence. And if you don't mind, maybe I'll just start out putting forward my
Sure.
thoughts on the matter. So from my own experience and from the studies that I've done, I really feel that religious violence is strongly rooted in political grievances. Political grievances, economic grievances, but that it's these things that are then amplified and wrapped up, clothed, if you will, in religious language by leaders who want to exploit the feelings of the masses to further agendas that are really all about power, about authority, those kind of things. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. What do you think, Kevin?
Well, thanks, first of all, for bringing this up. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot as well, and it's difficult to come up with an adequate answer to this. I think it's a complex problem. I think you're right, that there are a lot of political reasons that inform this kind of violence and that shape it. At the same time, I wonder if there's also a kind of lingering doctrinal dimension to this. The brute fact that there are differences in identity, that different religious communities don't view themselves the same way. So a Muslim community and a Christian community and a Jewish community are going to have different understandings of themselves, and they have different cherished ideas that really shape the way they live their lives. And I think what I heard you saying is that these things get manipulated, and persons in authority can use these as occasions for some kind of political agenda. And I agree with that. That's a great point. At the same time, the fact that they're there to be manipulated suggests that there's some real tension here,
Yeah,
ongoing tension.
that's an excellent point. I should probably take more serious that the real differences. What do you think, Emily?
Yeah, I think you guys are both making me think about a lot of things. Because, you know, when I think about religious violence, I immediately think of culture. You know, how culture gives us a lens for understanding, you know, why violence happens. It gives us a language for thinking about how that violence plays out. And that's where my mind always goes to immediately is, you know, how our culture shapes us. We shape our culture. We don't necessarily see that happening. And because of that, you know, that's why we don't necessarily think of it as being the reason why these things are happening. But I love thinking about ideas as more of, you know, something that is a big mover and shaper of what's going on, and the importance of political leaders. I mean, I can't think about culture without thinking about these things as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought up culture, because it got me thinking. So I had this idea I was thinking about our recent election, and you have candidates on the right and on the left who are not particularly religious, but have try to cultivate religious followings or use religious language, like Trump with evangelicals, or Bernie Sanders used to talk about how much he liked Pope Francis and his ideas.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, to me, I was thinking that was an example of politics really being at the heart of what's going on here. But your point about culture and your point about ideas is really well taken, because there's something about American culture that kind of forces our politicians to make those kind of statements, even if maybe it's not something that they would naturally do. So culture is a big part of it, and the ideas are different. I mean, they're making appeals to different sets of conflicting ideas, and so you certainly see that tension there.
Yeah, and what you were saying about culture is, I think, an important corrective to just a strong emphasis on doctrinal differences, because these doctrines have history to them, and this history is set in certain cultural contexts. So all these cherished values that go into shaping identities have this kind of long backstory and continue to be shaped by the cultural context in which they inhabit and in which they're fostered. And I think this is helpful also maybe for thinking about a possible solution to something like religious violence, because it sounds to me like all of these different things are important factors in this. And so any solution that would just focus on one of these to the exclusion of the others is going to be inadequate. So it's not either or, it's both and then another and, because it's three.
Yeah, excellent point.
Well, and I think, Kevin, as you were talking, you're saying how, if you try to solve religious violence, you can't focus on just politics or just ideas or just culture. You have to think about all three. I think it would be impossible to approach it just from the perspective of culture. And I think it would be impossible to approach it from just thinking about politics or just thinking about ideas. I think in many ways we're talking about the same things, as each of us were saying what we think. I think we think a lot alike.
Yeah, I think we probably do. Maybe we're just using different terms, and we're looking at the problem from slightly different angles.
Yeah.
But I think we recognize that it's a much more complex, multi-dimensional challenge, religious violence, and the solution is going to have to take account of that, and it's going to have aspects that deal with the political use of religion to foment violence or conflict, the cultural setting, and how unique that is. So I'm glad you brought up that point, and the ideas themselves, and particularly maybe it's going to require faith communities to look at their own traditions and emphasize those ideas which point more towards peacemaking, solidarity with others who aren't exactly like you, and so I think that we probably can come to an agreement that this is a much broader conversation that needs to include all these perspectives.
Yeah, you can't make a culture of inclusivity without ideas of inclusivity and leaders who speak about inclusivity. If you were missing any one of those three puzzle pieces, you're going to have just 2/3 of a puzzle. And that's not cool.
Yeah, well, that's not cool. Yeah. So, well, thank you both very much. Your opinions were great. Your contributions were great, and I really I'm going to think more on this issue.
Me too. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that went substantially better, don't you think? So my three colleagues have just engaged in what we would call dialogue, and you could see that they moved from debate to discussion to dialogue. And if you look really closely, you could see what was really different in the quality of their conversation. So the next time that you decide to get together as a group and either come to some kind of transformed understanding of a topic, or to start to look at a solution that might otherwise be very difficult, please keep in mind the difference between debate, discussion, and dialogue. I hope you've enjoyed my three colleagues, and I hope that you can put this into practice the next time that you sit down together. Thank you.